Hello everyone, my name is Luis Manen, and today this is my first webinar about local database. I'm going to be explaining adapters, contract, content provider, and helpers to create a local database using my SQLite. Okay, so far so good. So let me explain you a little bit about the movie contract class object. Please note, this is one of our Android degree projects, which is called Popular Movies. And in here, I created a local database to store all the fetching data returned from the movie API. So, in the movie contract class, this class is really important because we're going to be accessing the specific information variables from this class on other classes, such that the content provider, the database adapter, and the movies helper. In this class, we have three variables declared. One is the authority, the base content, and the path movie. The authority is representing the package name of your whole project. The base content URI is going to be an URL that is pointing to your specific path where the database schema is going to be saved. The path movie is the name of the folder file where your database is going to be stored. As you can see, we have a final class called movie entry, and it implements the interface base column. What is base column? Base column interface provide names for the very common ID and count columns of your database table. In this specific class, you have another variable which is called the content URI. The content URI is the exact URL that points towards your database. Here we get the URL base content URI, which is already predefined URL. We build that URL and then we append the movies before we build it. Below that specific variable declaration, you have what is called the public static final table name. The table name is referring to the name of your table in your database. Below, you will see a bunch of information which is actually referring to the data that we're going to be getting from the movie database API. The column ID is going to be representing the primary key of the values we are actually returning from the database movie API. The column's video URL is going to store the URL for all the videos of this movie. The column vote count is going to contain the count of how many people has voted towards this movie. The vote average is going to contain the average of all the users who has already voted in the movie. The title, which is another column name, is going to contain the title of the movie that we actually inserted or we are fetching. Below that, we have the column popularity. That's basically explaining how popular the movie is. Depending on the format of the data that you actually receiving, you're going to create a database table based on that specific format. For me, I wanted to keep track of all the specific information returned from the database. After that, I'm going to explain you a little bit about the movies helper. Please note that if you have any question, you can post it in the message board so that we can actually explain in details what the specific problems you have. The movies helper. The movies helper is another class that extends SQLite Open Helper. The SQLite Open Helper is an important class that gets called on the content provider. This SQLite Open Helper has two different variables that must be implemented. One of that is the movie schema. Why movie schema is because my database schema is called movies TV. And please note that you should never forget to put the format .db after the name that you give to the specific schema. The database version should be instantiated to 1, And if we change this specific version to a different value, then the database is gonna be upgraded. The movie helper constructor is going to be calling the super constructor from the SQLite open helper. This specific super constructor is going to accept 4 different parameters. One is the context of where you're calling this object. The movie schema is the name, string name of the specific schema you given to the database schema. The null factory you can instantiate it to null since we don't have to do anything with it right now. And the version is going to be instantiated to 1 since we just have the first version of our database table. The onCreate method gets override, and then in the onCreate method you receive one specific SQLiteDataBase object, and this SQLiteDataBase object is in charge of executing database queries. In this specific try and catch path, I have created a query which is going to create my table with the specific given name movies. Then I'm going to pass SQLite code to create the specific columns name that are actually needed to store the information data. The column ID is going to be an integer that is not going to be null and is our primary key. This is going to be our reference to get all the specific information about one movie or all the movies. The column video URL, as I explained, is going to store the specific URL of the video for the movie. The column vote average is going to contain a decimal point of all the average votes in the movie. The title is going to contain the title of the movie, and so on. After you create this string query, you call the SQLiteDataBase object to execute the query and create a table. If everything is correct, it will execute and it will not cause any SQL exception. But if the SQL query is not correct, you will going to contain one error that is going to be returning. The onUpgrade method. If you don't want to tongcreate, which means delete all the item and information from your database table, you shouldn't include this line over here. But if you want to all the time when you install the application, all the data that you previously have gets deleted, this method is going to be actually executing that task. Also, the onCreate method gets called. Let me explain you a little bit more about the Movies Content Provider. The Movies Content Provider. What is Content Provider? Content providers can help an application manage access to data stored by itself, stored by other apps, and provide a way to share data with other apps. In the Content Provider, we're going to instantiate 2 specific important final integer that is going to be referring a URI matcher for our database queries. One is the movies because we're going to be returning all the movies stored in the database. And the other one, but not least, is going to be the movie with ID. Here we can fetch the data in the database given one specific ID for a movie. The URI matcher gets instantiated on the beginning, and the URI matcher is going to contain 2 different specific matcher. One is going to have the movie, which means we're going to be returning all the movies in the database table, and the other one is going to have another matcher which is going to contain only the movie ID that we're actually looking for. The onCreate method gets override and it gets called when we instantiate the specific Movies Content Provider helper. This Movies Content Provider gets called in the manifest file. As you can see, in the Android manifest file, you have one thing that is called provider. This provider points to the specific provider that we actually describing as of now. You have the Android name, the specific package of your project, and the class name, which is Content Provider. Here, you also specify the authority, please make sure that the authority is exact to the name of your package, so that on runtime you don't get non-error. And also, please note, we need to specify if the specific provider is exported to be true or exported to be false. If exported is equals to false, that means that this database table is not going to share any data with any other apps. But if this Android exported is equals to true, then that means that the database that we currently have in our phone is going to be shareable with other apps who is actually getting access to it. Let's keep moving forward. The helper, as I explained, which is the movie helper, is in charge of creating the database. This specific movie content provider has 4 different methods. One is the query, that is in charge of executing the queries. The other one is the get type, which is unsupported at this moment. Another important method is actually the insert method, which is returning an URI with the URL from the content resolver and is in charge of inserting data into the database table. Another override method is called the delete method, and this method is in charge of deleting an item from the database. And lastly, but is actually the update method. This one is in charge of updating one tuple in the database table. One or many, excuse me. I'm going to explain a little bit about the insert method, which is actually getting some parameters. One is the URI, that is points to the specific URL path of your database schema. Then it's going to contain the content value, which is another object containing all the specific hash with key value pairs to be inserted in the database. After that, we declare a final SQL database and we ask the helper to give us writable access so that later on we can write into the database. Remember that we created a URI matcher. The URI match is going to match the URI that we pass. And after it detects, we're going to find out what we actually going to be executing. This match is going to be returning an integer. In our case, it's going to be 100, since we're going to be aiming to insert items. Case is movies, which means 100. Case is 100, we're going to get the ID. We ask the database, and then we insert the movies with the table name, no specific columns, but then we send the values. If the ID is greater than 0, then we successfully inserted the items into the database. Otherwise, we throw an exception with a specific error message. After you insert all the information into the database, then you get the context of the specific app and you call the getContentResolver object. And then you notify a change, which means this is going to be notifying the content provider that something was added into a specific database, passing the URI as parameter. A little bit more about the delete method. Here you can delete from the database using 2 different URI information. One could be deleting all the items from the database. On the other hand, deleting only one movie from the database. In this case, I'm going to explain you how to delete only one item from the database. You get the SQLiteDataBase access from the helper, which is writable database access. And then you get the match, which means you're going to match the URI that you want to execute. If it's actually a movie with a specific ID, you get the ID of that movie, and then you delete that movie from the database using the database.delete method. If everything executes, things will actually run smooth. But if not, there is going to be an error message. Well, once again, this is going to be only 15 minutes explaining about what is a movie content provider, the movies helper, movies contract, and I miss the database adapter.